Hey there, my name is Pam and I like to have adventures in crafting. Today I'm going to show you how to make this amazing dragon scale journal for all of your fantasy adventures. Materials used are listed in the video description.
Let's make a dragon scale book cover.
To begin, we are going to start with the covers. Take one 8.5 by 11 piece of chipboard and slice it in half. Shing! Awesome! Now you have the base for the front and back covers. Next we need to make the templates for our dragon scales. I sketched out a few ideas from individual scales to long strips of wavy lines. I decided the individual scales would be too tedious, and no one wants that, so I went with the long strips of wavy lines. When cut out and stacked just right, the wavy strips look just like scales. I got this idea from Punished Props when Bill made a dragon egg. And of course my brain immediately thought to make a notebook instead. Once you cut out some of the wavy scale templates, trace around the wavy edge on some craft foam using a pencil. Then cut the foam along the pencil line using a craft knife. You can use scissors, but the foam dulls the blade rather quickly, and I had to repeatedly sharpen the blade of my knife. You can use both sides of cut piece by slicing the upper and lower waves in half, giving you two different shapes of scales. Once I had all of my foam cut, I pieced them together alongside one of the chipboard covers to ensure I had enough. The next step is to cover the chipboard covers and make them look a little nicer. Cut two 12 by 12 pieces of cardstock in the color of your choice, I used black, to 7 by 10 inches for the outside. Mark one side of the cardstock at 3/4 inches around all sides to indicate the center where the chipboard will be placed. Apply glue to one side of the chipboard. I used wood glue, but any PVA glue should work fine. One day I'll invest in some fancy bookbinding PVA glue, but until then, wood glue, tacky glue, or Mod Podge for this girl. Stick the chipboard to the cardstock inside the marks you made. Trim the corners about 1/8 of an inch from the corners of the chipboard. Apply glue to the edges and fold the edges over the back side of the chipboard. Do this for all 4 sides. For the inside of the covers, cut another piece of cardstock, I used red, to 5 by 8 inches. Apply some more glue to this sheet and stick it to the inside cover, being careful to place it in the center. Put the covers under something heavy and leave them to dry. I left mine overnight. The next step is to create a template for where you want your stitches to be. I made mine at 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, and 5.5, 6.5, and 7.5 inches. Clamp the covers together the way they'd face each other on the book, and clamp the template on the covers, leaving about 1/4 inch at the edge. Punch holes along the marks on the template, 1/4 inch from the edge of the covers. Make sure to place a piece of foam or something underneath to prevent the awl from damaging your furniture. Yay! It's time to glue on the foam scales. I ended up using tacky glue and it actually worked really well. I didn't want to have to use contact cement, which is the best glue for foam to foam, so I experimented to see what would work for this project, and tacky glue worked fine. Apply glue to the top edge of the strip and stick it to the front cover. Alternate the placement of the scales as you go. At first I didn't trim the scales before gluing them down and quickly decided to cut the scale to size before gluing it to the cover. Basically, I would eyeball the placement and trim the edges with my craft knife before applying the glue and sticking the piece down. Keep placing the foam scales until you reach the top of the cover. Then I flipped the book and trimmed off the excess, overhanging the edge of the book. I used some super glue on some of the scales that were sticking up too much for my liking. Woohoo! Another step is done. Cover the cover with baking paper and something heavy and leave it to dry overnight. The next day, I painted the cover. But first I made sure the cover was in tip-top shape. I trimmed the edges a little bit more and sanded them a little to smooth out any rough spots, and poked through the cover holes once more with the awl to go through the foam as well. I started my paint job by brushing on 2 coats of paper Mod Podge. Why paper Mod Podge, you ask? Because that's all I had. This will act as a primer and sealer for the foam. I used red, blue, and gold paint for this project. Mix the red and blue to make a deep purple. and slop that all over the cover. Brush that nicely onto the cover. Make sure you get into all the nooks and crannies. I only needed one coat to cover the book, and I dried it with a heat gun set on low between coats. Next, take some of the red paint in a dry brush the red all over the cover, taking care to blend the red in as much as possible. Isn't she pretty? For the gold, I used a fan brush, which I've never used before, so that was fun. Apply the gold as a highlight over the edge of the scales with a dry brush. I used very little paint for this, and at times worried I had ruined the whole thing. In the end, I was super happy with how it turned out, and I like how the fan brush created lines on the scales that made them look like they had ridges. Finally, I went over the whole thing with a wash of black paint. My hope was that it would create some more depth to the scales, and honestly, I'm not sure it did anything. But this is probably because my painting skill level is about a 2. Ooh, ah. Okay, friends, we've reached the last step, the binding. Make as many signatures as you like by folding 8.5 by 11 inch paper in half and stacking around 4 pages together. I made 10 signatures of 4 pages each. Use your template clamped to the signatures to mark where the holes will be using a straight edge and a pencil. Then punch holes in the marks using an awl. Unfold one signature at a time and poke holes at the marks on the spine. We are going to use a Coptic stitch binding method. To stitch everything together, use some wax thread the length of your book times as many signatures you have plus 1. Thread a curved needle. You don't need a curved needle, it just makes it easier. Taking the cover and the first signature, sew through the first hole of the first signature from the inside, leaving a 3-inch tail. Sew through the inside to the outside of the cover. Sew back into the signature through the first hole. Sew to the second hole and through it. Go through the second hole of the cover from the inside to the outside and back into the second hole. Continue doing this to the end, and when you sew back into the last hole, tie a knot on the inside. So back out that last hole of the first signature. Pick up the next signature and sew into the corresponding hole on the second signature. Sew to the next hole on this signature and out through that hole. Sew around the 2 cover threads between the cover and the first signature. Sew back into the second signature through the same hole you came out of. Continue until you reach the end. Sew around the stitches between the cover and the first signature. Pick up a new signature and sew into the first hole. Sew to the next hole and through it. Sew under the 2 threads between the first and second signature. Sew back into the second hole again. If you need further instruction, I'd be happy to do a Coptic stitch binding tutorial separate in its own video. I'll link my last video in the cards above, where I also did a Coptic stitch binding and I explain this process a little bit more. To add the cover, go through the first hole of the cover from the inside to the outside. sew under the stitches between the second last and last signature. Sew back into the first hole of the last signature. Sew out of the second hole and through the second cover hole from the inside to the outside. Sew under the 2 threads between the 9th and 10th signatures and back through the second hole of the 10th signature. Continue until you reach the end and you've sewn through all the cover holes. Sew out the last hole through the cover, under the last stitch between the last 2 signatures, and back into the last signature through the last hole. Tie a double knot on the inside, and tuck in the end. Then cut the thread. Flip your book back to the first signature and tie off the end with a double knot. And cut the thread. Ta-da! One dragon scale book for all of your adventures or just to show off to your friends. My name is Pam and this is Total Pamarchy, the craft channel with a little anarchy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so we can hang out next time. Until then, have an amazing day and we'll see you later.